On the northern rim of Mesopotamia, where the grasslands blur into the mountains of the Caucasus, life moved not by borders, but by the breath of seasons. Nomads followed the rivers, their horses treading ancient paths carved by wind and memory. Around the late 7th century BC, a small band of Scythians, horse archers hardened by the endless steppe, wandered south, their herds straying into the lands of another tribe. There were no fences, no treaties, no maps, just instinct, hunger, and retaliation. A skirmish broke out, and that spark, seemingly insignificant, lit a chain reaction across the ancient Near East. Pressed from the north, the Medes, fierce highland clans of the Zagros, and the Babylonians, long rivals, began to cast wary glances not at each other, but at the crumbling edge of the Assyrian Colossus. Old enemies became uneasy allies. The Assyrian Empire, the very hammer of Mesopotamia, the scourge of cities, whose kings once claimed dominion over the four corners of the earth, began to falter. Not from grand armies or open revolt, but from migrations, waves of unfamiliar riders, pressure on borders, chaos in the outer provinces. So how did the greatest empire of its age, an empire built on conquest and terror, begin to fall? Not by war, but by movement. Let's begin. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe for more hidden stories from history, where the smallest spark can shift the fate of empires. At its zenith under King Ashurbanipal, 669 to 631 BC, the Neo-Assyrian Empire towered over the ancient Near East. It stretched from the banks of the Nile to the rugged Zagros mountains of Iran, from the Levantine coast deep into the fertile plains of Mesopotamia. No rival could match its reach or its ruthlessness. The Assyrian kings didn't just build palaces and libraries, they built fear. Carvings on their palace walls didn't celebrate peace or prosperity, but carnage. One relief shows captives flayed alive. Another, a pyramid of severed heads. These weren't exaggerations, they were declarations. As one scholar aptly put it, Assyria didn't just rule through force, it ruled through reputation. Even the Bible, hardly neutral, records the dread. Prophets like Isaiah and Jonah spoke of Assyria as an instrument of divine wrath, a terror from the north. And modern historians have not forgotten. Some now call it the First Empire of Evil, a phrase that, while dramatic, reflects the systematic brutality embedded in its governance. Power radiated from the king himself, monarch of monarchs, seated in Nineveh or Ashur, where gold-leafed thrones faced walls etched with his triumphs. The empire's administrative web was vast. Core regions run by Assyrian governors, peripheries left to local kings so long as tribute flowed and loyalty held. When kings like Tiglath-Pileser III sensed weakness, even those semi-independent allies were swiftly annexed and absorbed into the imperial machine. Yet rule wasn't just about soldiers and scribes, it was about spectacle. Enormous wall reliefs, some stretching dozens of feet, showed Assyrian kings like Sennacherib charging into battle, arrows flying, horses rearing. These images weren't art for art's sake, they were state propaganda, carved in stone to remind visitors, diplomats, and subjects. This was not a realm of negotiation, this was a realm of conquest. Assyrian rule rested on fear. Terror was not a byproduct of conquest. It was the foundation of statecraft. The regime institutionalized cruelty as a matter of policy, turning it into a language of domination. When Assyria crushed a city, it did not simply defeat its army. It made an example of it. One infamous inscription by King Ashurnasirpal II survives as a chilling testament to this philosophy. He boasted, "I built a pillar and flayed all the chief men who had revolted. Some I impaled upon the pillar on stakes. Many captives I burned with fire. Some I cut off their hands and fingers. I put out the eyes. These were not the hidden crimes of rogue soldiers. They were state-sanctioned acts of terror, carved into palace walls to warn all who might dare resist. Under King Ashur-Nirari II, Assyrian warfare reached new depths of horror. In his own words, "I took the city and slew many warriors. I seized all that could be taken. I cut off the heads of the fighters and raised before the city a tower of skulls and bodies, a tower of the living. I built the young men I impaled upon stakes around the city, and the maidens I cast into the flames. Thus did I make known the might of my hand and the terror of my rule." This was no chaotic violence. It was a strategy, refined and deliberate. The Assyrian state cultivated psychological warfare with chilling precision. After a city fell, the Assyrians often deported its entire population. Unlike other empires that targeted elites or potential troublemakers, Assyria moved whole towns. Craftsmen, scholars, and laborers were marched off to distant corners of the empire, while foreign settlers were brought in to take their place. The goal was to break the connection between a people and their homeland, to erase their identity and smother the possibility of rebellion. A city stripped of its intellectuals and skilled hands was a city too hollowed to rise again. This repressive machinery became even more formidable under Tiglath-Pileser III. He revolutionized the Assyrian military, creating the empire's first standing professional army. Impoverished peasants were recruited and equipped at the state's expense. Troops underwent regular training and served in specialized divisions: chariotry, cavalry, heavy and light infantry, and engineers. The result was a fighting force of unmatched discipline, reach, and mobility, capable of delivering both swift conquests and slow, agonizing sieges. Assyrian punishment knew no limits. Rebels and their leaders were tortured in public and killed in ways meant to haunt both the living and the memory of their people. Many were flayed alive. Some were impaled. Others had their limbs severed and tongues cut out. The remains of the executed were left to rot in the open, devoured by dogs and pigs. Assyrian kings described these scenes in their own inscriptions, not as aberrations, but as triumphs. Ashurbanipal, after one resounding victory, entered a temple in a grim procession. His chariot was pulled not by horses, but by 5 vanquished kings, while his captives wore the severed heads of rebel princes around their necks. Every gesture was theater, terror as performance, cruelty as message. The assault extended even to the spiritual world. The Assyrians were among the first to engage in what modern historians have dubbed god-napping. They destroyed temples, looted sacred objects, and carried off the statues of local deities, believing that if a god were taken from its home, the people would lose heart. In one campaign, Sargon II seized the gods Haldi and Bagbartu of Urartu and relocated them to Assyria, alongside the city's royal family. By removing the gods, Assyria suggested that even the divine had abandoned the defeated. The king, styled as King of the Universe and Son of the Gods, claimed divine sanction and upheld his authority through elaborate titles and rituals. Every facet of governance served the empire's militaristic agenda. Roads linked frontier fortresses, palaces functioned as military command centers, and tribute from conquered peoples filled the royal treasury, fueling further campaigns. Even within the Assyrian heartland, dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. Provincial officials who faltered or rebelled faced swift removal, or worse. It was through this systematic use of fear, this blend of brutality, propaganda, and psychological warfare, that Assyria built the greatest empire of its time. Such episodes strengthened the imperial throne in the short term, but also sowed deep resentment. The legacy it left was not simply in walls, canals, or trade routes, but in a trail of cowed vassals and embittered survivors plotting revenge. Assyria's neighbors reacted in different ways. Some longed for independence, while others waited patiently, hoping for the Assyrian juggernaut to falter. To the south, proud Babylonia, the heir of Hammurabi's ancient legacy, had suffered under Assyrian domination for generations. Though allowed a vassal king, often even one of Ashurbanipal's brothers, Babylonian elites resented foreign rule. Their deep cultural pride was only inflamed by the Assyrians' desecration of Marduk's temples. When Ashurbanipal died around 631 BC, Babylonian nobles sensed an opportunity. In 626 BC, a local chieftain named Nabopolassar rose in revolt, declared himself king, and ignited a rebellion that soon expelled Assyrian garrisons. By the late 620s BC, Babylon had become the rallying point for those who had endured Assyrian oppression. To the east, the Elamites of Susa, though crushed by Ashurbanipal in 647 BC in what amounted to near annihilation, had not disappeared entirely. Survivors fled westward and joined Nabopolassar's growing coalition. Babylonian records attest to Elamite forces marching alongside their allies to avenge the destruction of their homeland. Even in defeat, Elam contributed to the undoing of its ancient enemy. From the rugged Zagros mountains came the Medes, mountain tribes long harassed by Assyrian campaigns. By the late 7th century BC, these tribes began uniting under King Cyaxares. When they struck, they did so with devastating force. In the north, the kingdom of Urartu had fiercely resisted Assyrian aggression for centuries. In the 8th century BC, Urartu's kings repelled repeated Assyrian invasions. One such humiliation was suffered by the king of Musasir, who, after his city was plundered and his gods stolen by Sargon II, took his own life. By the 7th century, however, Urartu had weakened and would soon fall to the Medes after Assyria's collapse. Still, its persistent defiance testified to the resentment Assyria had fostered among its neighbors. Elsewhere, the Arameans, Phoenicians, and Egyptians endured Assyrian incursions. Some, like the city of Tyre, submitted through tribute, while others resisted fiercely. Egypt witnessed the armies of Esarhaddon conquer Memphis in 671 BC. Across the Levant, local rulers oscillated between vassalage and rebellion, never forgetting the heavy boots that marched through their lands. In time, this widespread bitterness coalesced into unity. Oppressed peoples across the region watched the blood-stained banners of Assyria and quietly prayed for the day its chariots would falter. Babylon's defiance inspired hope. Though the walls of Nineveh stood tall, vengeance gathered beyond them. Among the first to recognize the looming threat was Ben-Hadad, king of Aram Damascus. Alarmed by Assyria's expanding grip and its interference in the kingdom of Aleppo, which had already fallen into vassalage, Ben-Hadad knew he could not stand alone. He forged an alliance of kings and tribal leaders that soon included Ahab, king of Israel, and Jundub, a powerful Arab chieftain with 1,000 camels and hundreds of warriors. Over time, this coalition grew to encompass 11 or 12 kingdoms across the Levant and desert margins, united to halt the Assyrian tide, not just for revenge, but for survival. Despite its towering walls and fearsome reputation, the Assyrian Empire was bleeding from within. Years of near-constant rebellion had drained its strength. Egypt had slipped away, Lydia to the far west ignored Assyrian commands, and the Medes refused to submit again. The empire was overstretched, exhausted, and fracturing. After Ashurbanipal's death, chaos erupted. Civil war broke out between his successors, And for the first time in centuries, Assyria lacked a strong ruler. Provinces began peeling away. Elam declared independence, and in Babylon, Nabopolassar seized the moment, declaring freedom and launching a war of liberation. By 616 BC, Babylon had broken free of Assyrian control. Nabopolassar didn't stop there. In 615 BC, he boldly crossed into Assyrian heartland, pillaging towns and testing the empire's once invincible power. King Sin-shar-ishkun scrambled to respond, but his fractured armies and dwindling loyalty hampered his efforts. Meanwhile, the Medes under King Cyaxares united the highland tribes and in 614 BC struck a devastating blow by capturing and destroying Assur, the original Assyrian capital and a city sacred to their identity. This was not only a military loss, but a spiritual one. The sacred city lay in ruins. Soon after, the Medes formed an alliance with Nabopolassar on Assur's ashes. The coalition now included Babylonians, Medes, Elamite survivors, Aramean rebels, tribes from Susa, and even forces from Lydia. Nomadic raiders like the Scythians and Cimmerians pillaged Assyria's northern frontiers. The world had turned decisively against the empire that once terrorized it. The Medes advanced westward like a tidal wave, devastating Assyria's borders. The empire, brittle from internal strife and depleted forces, could no longer resist. Even the once loyal military elite faltered. Ashurbanipal's symbolic reign was over, and the once mighty empire was left leaderless. Egypt, always watchful and opportunistic, re-entered the power struggle. Pharaoh Psamtik moved into the vacuum, occupying Syria, Canaan, and the Levant, hoping to curb Babylonian influence and replace Assyria as regional overlord. But Nabopolassar would not be deterred. Sin-shar-ishkun, desperate to halt the collapse, forged a last-ditch alliance with Urartu, the kingdom of Mania, and Egypt. However, this coalition came too late. Nabopolassar crushed their forces in the west, while Cyaxares advanced from the east. Both armies raced toward the empire's final stronghold. In 612 BC, these forces converged on Nineveh, the jewel of the Assyrian Empire. Cyaxares arrived first, ready to strike the decisive blow that would end the empire's long reign of terror. In the twilight years of the 7th century BC, along the eastern banks of the Tigris River, stood one of the greatest cities ever built by human hands, Nineveh. Known to the ancients as Nineveh and lying where modern-day Mosul rests, Nineveh rose from humble beginnings as a trade outpost to become the heart of the most powerful empire the ancient Near East had ever known, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. At its zenith, Nineveh was not merely a city. It was the embodiment of imperial majesty, innovation, and cultural achievement. Its walls stretched vast and wide, enclosing a metropolis adorned with lush gardens, intricate canals, and monumental gateways, 15 in all, each one opening onto streets lined with statues and exotic flora. Around 700 BC, King Sennacherib declared Nineveh his capital and transformed it into a marvel of engineering. He constructed boulevards, public parks, and an advanced irrigation system that made gardens bloom in the Mesopotamian desert. His most ambitious project was the Palace Without Rival, a sprawling structure of over 80 rooms, featuring colossal bronze columns resting on the backs of lions and bulls, each weighing over 40 tons, and walls covered in elaborate reliefs that celebrated Assyrian might. Nineveh was a city of intellect as much as splendor. Under Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, the city became a beacon of learning. His famed library housed more than 30,000 clay tablets, meticulously catalogued by scribes. These texts preserved centuries of Mesopotamian knowledge, astronomy, medicine, epic poetry, and divination, capturing the soul of Assyria and the civilizations that preceded it. The city's population was a vibrant mosaic. People from every corner of the empire brought their customs, languages, and faiths. Palaces stood beside temples. Markets buzzed near zoological gardens. Water flowed through aqueducts feeding orchards and public spaces. Nineveh had become a mirror of the world it ruled. But that mirror was about to shatter. So in 612 BC, the coalition descended upon Nineveh. Though there is no direct depiction of the siege itself, scholars have relied on surviving Assyrian reliefs, especially a rare image showing a siege ramp under construction, to hypothesize what the siege might have looked like. The siege techniques portrayed in Assyrian art may have been mirrored or adapted by the Babylonian-Median coalition that attacked Nineveh. One relief depicts kneeling archers firing volleys of arrows at unseen defenders on the battlements, while another group advances up a siege ramp protected by large, curved shields. Behind them, slingers launch stones upwards toward defenders, providing additional cover. At the base of the ramp, men carry heavy slabs, likely to reinforce the ramp or prepare foundations for siege engines, while others lay down layers of palm fronds, probably to stabilize the structure and absorb shock. The use of palm fronds is particularly significant, as it suggests construction in a southern environment where date palms were abundant, similar to the region around Babylon. This aligns with the Assyrians' known southern campaigns, making it plausible that the Babylonian-Median alliance employed similar tactics during their assault on Nineveh. Though speculative, this reconstruction is grounded in the best available evidence. Given that Assyrian siege ramps, like the one excavated at Lachish, were massive engineering feats, it is likely that the attackers at Nineveh used comparable methods: layered earthworks, shielded archers, and a concerted push up a purpose-built ramp to breach the city's formidable defenses. Despite fierce resistance, the walls were eventually breached. The siege lasted 3 months, marked by brutal attrition. Assyrian texts speak of siege engines battering the walls as if with hammers. According to the Babylonian Chronicle, King Sin-Sharishkan perished during the defense, and the city, Nineveh, the heart of the Assyrian world, was overrun. The empire's long list of enemies had gathered, not just at its gates, but within its very soul. Civil wars, overextension, and years of rebellion had hollowed Assyria out from the inside. It had become a giant with feet of clay, and now, with the jewel of the empire in ruins, the world it once ruled stood witness to its fall. After the remarkable victories it once achieved, what caused this mighty military machine to collapse so swiftly? Researcher P. Garelli once remarked, "The fall of this kingdom appears as a blot on the pages of history, something difficult to accept. How can one reconcile the crushing defeat of such a colossal military power by forces like the Chaldeans and Medes, whose military strength was nowhere near that of Assyria? Indeed, although the Chaldeans were capable of conducting siege warfare due to their solid organization, their forces alone were insufficient to overwhelm the Assyrian army. The alliance with the Medes certainly complicated the movements of Assyrian infantry, but many scholars agree that it was neither the enemy's military strength nor their tactics that brought down Nineveh. Rather, the root cause was internal civil revolts that erupted starting in 627 BC. These internal upheavals exhausted the resources and morale of the Assyrian kingdom, explaining the events unfolding in Assyria and the Near East during this turbulent period. The sack of Nineveh was unparalleled in brutality. Even the Babylonians, no strangers to Assyrian cruelty, expressed horror at the ferocity of the Medes, who slaughtered civilians, razed temples, and burned the city to the ground. Children, priests, and nobles were cut down without mercy. The devastation shocked the ancient world. Some classical writers and Old Testament accounts suggest that a flood, possibly from the Caucasus River, which ran through Nineveh, hastened the fall by washing away sections of the city wall. But this remains debated, as August, the month when Nineveh fell, was unlikely to produce floods in that region. Whether by steel or water, the defenses crumbled. With Nineveh destroyed, the Assyrian state collapsed. Only remnants of its forces survived, retreating west to Haran, where Ashur-uballit II, a scion of the royal line, made a final stand from 610 to 609 BC. He sought aid from Egypt, but Pharaoh Necho's support came too late. Haran fell to the Babylonians and Medes in 609 BC, marking the final end of the Assyrian Empire. What remains of Nineveh today lies buried beneath the soil of Mosul. Ironically, it is the fire that destroyed the city that preserved its memory. The clay tablets of Ashurbanipal's library, baked hard in the flames, survived the centuries, and now whisper the stories of a lost world, of gods and kings, of conquests and questions, of a people who once dreamed of eternity. In the immediate aftermath of Nineveh's fall, the Neo-Babylonian Empire rose from the ashes. Under Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon would come to dominate the ancient Near East. Yet the story of Assyria, from the grandeur of Ashurbanipal's great library to the smoking ruins of its capital, had reached its final chapter. The iron death that Assyria once inflicted on others had now been unleashed upon itself. Modern historians often reflect on Assyria's legacy as a civilization built on terror and subjugation. Its fall serves as a stark, cautionary finale to what many call the first empire of evil, a mighty power undone by the very force and fear it used to rule. Across the region, various states and peoples, the Aramean cities, Anatolian tribes, and even Egypt, responded to Assyrian domination with rebellion, diplomacy, and ultimately, a coalition united against their common oppressor. Their combined efforts in 612 BC shattered the Assyrian Empire. In narrative terms, the empire that once ruled through terror collapsed beneath the accumulated weight of that terror, a dramatic reversal fitting for a regime once branded evil by its enemies. Yet from the ashes of destruction came preservation. The fire that consumed Nineveh did not erase Assyrian history entirely. Ashurbanipal's famed library survived, its 30,000 clay tablets, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved by the very flames that destroyed the city. Sometimes, destruction becomes the unlikely guardian of history. After Nineveh, the remnants of the Assyrian army, backed by Egypt, regrouped in the city of Haran. The last Assyrian king, Ashur-uballit II, struggled to rally his battered empire, but his efforts were in vain. By 610 BC, the Medes captured Haran, and shortly after, Nabopolassar's forces crushed the final Assyrian-Egyptian resistance. With Ashur-uballit II's death, attempting one last stand with Egyptian allies, the Assyrian dynasty that had ruled for centuries came to an end. Assyria ceased to exist as an independent political entity, spanning a vast region. This shift in power between the Medes and Babylonians didn't just end an empire, it reshaped the map of the ancient world in ways no one at the time could have fully grasped. What followed was not just chaos, but motion. Waves of displaced peoples, conquerors, refugees, opportunists, began to move. The Medes pushed east into the Iranian plateau, establishing a new power that would soon pave the way for the Achaemenids. The Babylonians, flush with triumph, turned their eyes to consolidating Mesopotamia. But they too faced new pressures, as peoples beyond the Zagros and further east began to shift. Those shifts didn't stop in Mesopotamia. The Scythians, whose nomadic roots once brushed the fringes of Assyria, began pushing further, skirting around the Caspian, their movements displacing or absorbing other tribes. One such displaced group, the Saka, would eventually filter down through Bactria and into the Indian subcontinent. There, they'd clash with and blend into local cultures, paving the way for larger formations like the Indo-Scythians and later, indirectly, the Kushan Empire. Meanwhile, further east, the Kushans themselves, descendants of the Yuezhi, pushed westward by the expansion of the Xiongnu in China, would feel the tremors too. As the chain reaction rippled out, these peoples collided, migrated, and formed new states on the margins of old empires. By the time the Maurya Empire rose in India 2 centuries later, the memory of Assyria was a ghost, but the consequences of its fall still echoed, like distant thunder over the steppes. The fall of Assyria wasn't just a closing chapter. It was the first page of another book, one that would span from the Caucasus to the Ganges, and eventually to the gates of Chang'an. If this journey through forgotten crossroads and quiet turning points stirred your curiosity, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that lie beneath the surface of great events. Leave a comment. What do you think was the real spark that lit the fall of the Assyrian Empire? And if you enjoyed this video, give it a like. It helps others find our corner of history. Thanks for spending your time with me today. Until next time, take care.